Hi, my name is Emily Walker, and this is my midterm presentation for my producing class. And I chose to do the TV show Jane the Virgin for my project. The episode that I chose for my project was the pilot episode of Jane the Virgin, and it does a lot to set up the characters, so I was able to pull a lot of information from just this episode alone, and it ended up being really interesting. I chose this show because my dad and sister watched it a couple of months ago, and so I had seen them watching it at home a lot, and they really liked it for a long time. So when this project came up, I thought about that show, and it was very helpful because I already knew some of the information about the characters in this show because I had seen my family watch it before. So that was very helpful for helping me to get Easter eggs and understand different things of the show a bit more. And it's also just a really interesting show in general. It covers a lot of subjects that other shows don't really tend to cover, and goes a lot into religion and sex and abortion, and it covers a lot of those subjects that can be really important that other shows don't tend to cover. So it's a really interesting show for a lot of reasons. Yeah. Okay, so some of the stuff that I noticed about the production while I was watching the show was that throughout the show they very subtly used music to kind of transition the show along, and sound effects were also used to transition the show, and graphics were used for transitions, and all of it was just really well thought out. Additionally, the wardrobes were thought out very well for each of the characters. It helped build their characters up a little bit and make them more in depth. And props would repeatedly come up. And I go more in depth in all of this in the next couple of slides, but all of that was really interesting and really cool to see when you really take a close look at the show. So as I said earlier, one of the things I noticed about the characters was that their wardrobes were used a lot to help convey things about them by showing us instead of telling us. So for the abuela, she would always be dressing very modestly, and would always wear a cross to show her religious convictions because she's Catholic. So that was, and then also Xiomara, the mom, would dress a bit more revealing to show kind of a little bit of her rejection of those ideals from her mother, and show that she's a bit more of a party girl. And then Jane, who would dress modestly because she is also religious, but she would be a little bit more revealing than Abuela and not as outwardly expressive about her religion. So she also dressed quite a bit more modern than Abuela. So those were all really helpful for learning more about the characters just by seeing them. Next was the music and sound effects that were used in this episode. Music was really used very subtly and very well in this show. It was used quite often to transition from one scene to another. So it'd be kind of a pop song, and then it would transition into kind of a drummy, high tempo beat for the next scene with a different character. So it was used in a really interesting way there, and very subtly. If I hadn't been looking for it, I probably would not have noticed it. And there was also, I didn't notice a ton of sound effects, but they were also very subtle, so I might have just not noticed them, which means that they were integrated very well. Yeah, so that's how music and sound effects were used in Jane the Virgin. Alright, next I wanted to talk about the significance of the white flower throughout the episode. The white flower was used during the episode to represent virginity. At the beginning of the episode, it showed a young Jane, and her grandmother was telling her to crumble up a white flower, and told her that that flower represented her virginity, and after you lose your virginity, you can't really get it back, was what she was trying to teach Jane. And this flower came back up several times throughout the episode. It was used during a flashback scene to show how this started, with Jane's mother coming back home to tell the abuela about that she was pregnant, and the grandmother had been holding a flower at the time and crumbled it in shock. And then it was used you could see it hanging on a wall in the background in most of the scenes that would talk about sex and virginity. And then at the very end of the episode, it was there was a yellow flower that Jane was wearing, and that fell off after Jane proposed to Michael. So it was used quite a few times throughout the episode to kind of go along with the story and represent the sex and virginity and those topics throughout the story. I did notice one Easter egg during this show, or during this episode, and the Easter egg was at the very beginning of the episode. Jane said goodbye to her fiance as he left for work, and she came to watch a telenovela with her mom and her grandmother. And the man on the telenovela is later revealed to be Jane's father. At the very end of the episode, you find this out. And so Jane's mother looks over at Jane to kind of see her reaction to seeing her father on TV, but Jane doesn't know it's her father yet, and doesn't even know it's her father at the end of the episode. So it's kind of a little hints, Easter egg to kind of foreshadow what's going to happen, and the kind of twist that'll be revealed later in the season. I was a little bit surprised with how much planning was involved in this episode alone. The shots were very well planned out. For example, with the white flower that was used to represent virginity, you could see it in the background. They angled the camera so you could see it in the background when her and her mother or her grandmother were talking about virginity or sex or pregnancy. And so that was very well planned out. And the wardrobes and how they told us information about the characters also surprised me, just how they planned out those outfits and those characters. And there were a lot of just very short, small shots that would take. They were less than 5 seconds, and just the planning of that those will be in there was surprising to me. So next, what scene I thought was most expensive to shoot was probably the hotel party scene at the very beginning of the episode. This scene required a ton of actors and a ton of extras. There were, I think, at least 4 or 5 main characters in this scene alone. And it was a party scene, so there were like at least 100 extras that they had to get there. So it probably involved a lot of like planning on where people would be and like setting up objects. There was the mermaid outfit that Jane wore during this scene, so that would have taken a while to plan out and get created for this scene alone. And then there were several like bottles of champagne and a ton of glasses and just different waiters, and there was a bar there and a lot of like just different characters, some large and some small. And there was just a lot that was happening in the scene. So yeah, that was probably the most expensive and time-consuming scene to make for this show. There were a couple of interesting locations during this show, or during this episode. One of them was at the very beginning. We got to see the hotel and a lot of the pool area. And it's a very big area. There's different tents, there's a bar, there's the pool, and you just get to see a lot of different areas just of that one location. Another place I thought was interesting was Jane's house and bedroom. They both had a lot of personality to them. And you could, of course, see the flower on Jane's wall. That kind of like was just a very big part of this episode. And those were just 2 really interesting locations to me during this episode. So yeah. So, how many scenes were there in total in this show? I counted 49 different scenes for this. There were a lot of different varying lengths of these scenes. There were some very long scenes. Some were very short, like even to be like only a couple of seconds long, so much that I would almost miss them. And like they would sometimes cut in and out of each other and overlap, because there was one scene where it was like 2 people were having a call and it kept like jumping back and forth between them. So they kind of used that in a bit of a creative way. But yeah, there were quite a few scenes for this one show, and that kind of surprised me. But it was actually a little bit less than I thought it would be. I was assuming there would probably be about 60 scenes for this one show, but I was wrong. So, yep. Alright, so that is the end of my presentation. Yeah, I watched that one episode of Jane the Virgin, and I think I learned a lot about the show and a lot about how much like pre-production you have to put into these kind of things to make sure that they like turn out as well as this one episode for this show did, because that must have been weeks upon weeks of just planning for all of those different scenes and like different characters, and just it was a lot more planning than I thought it would be.